Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Ultimate Countdown Review Podcast. This is part 3 of 3, in an ideal world at least. Let's not take forever, lads. And this is probably the part that is the most important and exciting factor of the 3-part special, because today we're going to talk about the fights that were missed off the top 100 and possibly had a shout of being in. Of course, in order to do that, I need to be with the titular man himself, NJG Wu.
Yes, hello.
And the ever-recurring review man, Toon Ganondorf.
Hello, everybody.
And so with that, I shall hand over to the man we just mentioned, who can talk about the format of the video for a little bit.
Thank you. So, with so many fights not on the list, it's inevitable that we're going to have a lot of suggestions for fights that should go on the list. We have taken some time, tabulated the results, and we've highlighted the ones we think are most worthy of discussion, most potential for discussion, and we're going to we're going to list them chronologically by series and use that as a discussion. So we're going to start with the first series, work all the way through to series 10. If your shouts were not adequately addressed, if you feel that we didn't go into enough detail, you're always welcome to leave comments, and we'll see if we can weigh in the comment section to discuss them with you there. We've got lots of nominations from Discord and from Reddit and from YouTube, and with that much to be said, I think we'll start at the start. Any other input, Toast? Or was that pretty much it?
Well, yeah, just to say that we certainly read everybody's comments, no matter which format it was used for. We couldn't put them all in the interest of time, and of course there's a lot of overlap with some of the nominations, but like we say before, if we missed off your nomination in this video, just stick it straight back in the comments and we can give you a text response instead. But the most notable ones have been put into this podcast agenda.
So, Series 1 to 2 wasn't a whole lot of nominations or really objectively missing fights. The Series 1 and 2 title fights were their respective representations, and those have been discussed. As far as missing fights, Series 1 didn't really have... probably the most notable fights, Recyclops and Mortis, not nominated, very controversial. Prince of Darkness, Tracy. The Damn Beaver gave a shout to Cunning Plan versus Demolisher. Lots of little fun Series 1 fights, but nothing that we felt was objectively missing.
Certainly not anything missing, but I mean, if you ask me what was the best fight from Series 1, apart from the title fight, which is a clear winner, then I would honestly just bend the rules a little bit. I would dive into Heat D, and they did technically air the Master vs. Thor in full with Jonathan Pierce commentary, so it counts.
Yeah. So
and
you
it
can
would
see...
genuinely be my shout, because there's damage in it. It's got the iconic right in the jugular veins! And it was just nice to see two robots actually working competently in that series. Only problem is, they weren't from that series.
So you can see Series 1 we're not going to cover in particular depth. Series 2, very similar. There's arguably some room to be made for Robodoc versus King Buxton or Roadblock versus King Buxton. But really the only one that we felt could have been given a shout was Killatron v Behemoth. And even then, that probably would have been around the 180, 170 mark on an objective list. So not a whole lot for discussion, other than to suggest it was probably the next one in line. Unless there are any other Series 2 fights that you guys think belong there, feel free to drop us a line. So that being said, let's move on to Series 3 with 4 minutes and 40 seconds. That's pretty good pacing so far. We've already done 2 series. Series 3 was the only series that nominated, officially, through the show, a fight of the series. There were nominations for Big Cheese versus Chaos 2, Hypnodisc versus Robogeddon, and Panic Attack versus Exterminator. The winner was Big Cheese versus Chaos 2. Whilst the other 2 nominees both made it onto Nick's list, Big Cheese and Chaos 2 did not. And arguably, one can make the case that this was probably the biggest surprise that was omitted from the list. Nick, let's have a talk about Big Cheese and Chaos 2.
Yeah, absolutely, let's. Because, as you can imagine, I've had some interesting comments when people started to realise that this wasn't on the list. Not particularly friendly ones, but it happens. Yeah, as you said, this was one of 3 fights nominated for Fight of the Series. The other 2 made it onto the list, and it's an interesting one because Chaos 2 The Big Cheese is a fight that stands out as much for House Robot moments, with Sergeant Bash being lifted over, as much as it does for the combat, which in this case wasn't particularly high class. Hypnodisc Robogeddon is a destruction fight in Robot Wars' infancy. Panic Attack Exterminator is a full-paced driving match with high standards of action throughout. And Razor Behemoth, which then happened in the First World Championship, again, that speaks for itself. It's high-class action throughout. Whereas this, although it's between 2 very good machines, the Big Cheese can't self-right. So Chaos 2 flips it once early in the battle, and it could have left it there to attempt to allow Roger Plant to self-right. But George, being who he is, continues, and the Big Cheese gets back over. And then when it gets flipped again later in the fight, you see that the Big Cheese was basically out of the running to win this fight whenever Chaos 2 wanted it to be. But, yeah. At the same time, we do have the Big Cheese carrying out an attack, even though it wasn't a game changer of one. It's still 2 machines carrying out attacks in Series 3, so that's a positive in its own right. And then the House Robot drama does still happen, which adds to the fight. In my case, I actually used that as a negative early on, because as I emphasised in previous parts of this review podcast, I focused on, with it being the top 100, I wanted to get 100 or 90 plus fights of truly tense, close, competitive fights. And this fight felt like it had too many holes in it in that regard. But as you go on in the list, there is space for versatile fights with different types of outcomes or pacing or moments in them. And once I released more and more episodes of this Ultimate Countdown, I did realise that, yeah, this absolutely had a spot in the list. But unfortunately, by the time I realised that, it was already too late, because I would have had to get rid of an amazing fight to shove it back in. So,
and that's a really good point, to be fair to Nick. The way that he released it episodically, 10 by 10, starting with the 100 to 90, if he'd started at the top and worked his way down, it might have been easy to swap it out. You could swap out something like Tornado Anarchy or Hypnodisc versus Firestorm in the playoff. Those could easily have been dropped and Big Cheese sandwiched in just so it made it. But when you start with the bottom, with the 10, and work your way up to the top 10, it makes it very hard, because by the time you get to episode 5, when you're in the top 50, all of a sudden you've got all these great fights that now need to go from 50 to 101 just to fit Big Cheese and Chaos 2 in. And whilst I think that probably the last chance to do that, and I believe we talked about it back when you were compiling the list, the last chance to do that was Firestorm versus Tornado. Once that was in, there was no room for anything else. The top, I think, 38, was that 39th or was that 49th? I think it was 39th. The top 38 were pretty much locked in place.
Yeah.
So once you'd aired that fight, there was no room to move. And whilst I don't think it probably belonged in the top 40, I would certainly have put it in around the 60s, probably at the expense of something like, well, Magnetor versus Thor, or even, Concussion versus Thor would have been fine to drop if we got this instead, but I understand what happened.
Encouraged.
Yeah. At that stage of the list, the 80s to 60 mark, that was when I wish I had my turnaround to say, yeah, this fight is good enough. But unfortunately, at that stage of the list, the fights were so incredibly varied that it didn't really come to my mind until we got to the consistently higher fights, funnily enough, that, yeah, Chaos 2 Big Cheese could hold its own just below this area. Whereas the 70 to 60 region kind of was a mesh of loads of different types of fights, so I couldn't really say, oh yeah, that compares well to this group of fights, because they're all so different. And then obviously when it came along, it was too late, and I had to accept my punishment.
But yeah, no, I think that was a fairly fair discussion. Looking at the list again now, I would probably, if I was to put a spot, I'd probably push down Storm 2 and Steel Avenger and put it just there, pretty much on par with that, because they're very similar. The fight was ended as soon as the winning robot wanted to end it. That would be as high as I could probably justify putting it. I mentioned in a previous podcast that if you asked 2010 era Robot Wars wiki fans what the top 10 was, you'd get an incredibly generic list that would include fights like this and Dietor Tornado, both of which have taken a tumble in the stances. This, I think, less deservingly than Tornado versus Dietor, but yeah, incredibly generic choice. I'm glad we didn't go for a super generic top 10, but I do think this was ultimately shafted. I'm glad that we've sort of addressed that, and I think we can move on to the next nomination, unless there's anything else wants to be added.
Yeah, no, I think we're good to move on. Especially because if Chaos 2 versus the Big Cheese was the most obvious omission for Series 3, I think what we next need to go through for Series 3 would probably lead to the one which I think is probably a better fight in my opinion, because what we want to do now is briefly glance over the entire Hypnodisc campaign. And we got the first two Hypnodisc fights on the list, of course. Whether or not they were underrated was a different story for a different podcast.
They were.
But then, the first one to actually be omitted is, I think, the strongest shout for Series 3 to get another fight on. And that was Hypnodisc versus Berserk 2.
What? Which I remember being excellent as a kid. I understand now Hypnodisc's disc playing up was a large reason for why it was close. So we won't really discuss that particularly much. The most passionate shout out for Hypnodisc Series 3 fight, I think, was for Stegosaurus.
The overrated and overglorified, but ultimately still iconic title fight. So it just gets drowned out as much as I think it's
And yeah, and we also
utterly
have to
strong,
blame
but-
Hypnodisc versus Stegosaurus for ruining the title fight, because that's what put Hypnodisc into disrepair.
And
yeah,
Stegosaurus
yeah.
into disrepair because we didn't get a playoff either. So
Well, there we go.
Yeah, wow. So it's in the bottom 10 for us now.
So, to close off Series 3, there was a couple of other shouts that we're going to lump in together for general discussion. King Buxton versus 101 in the Heat final of Heat J, and All Talk versus Thing 2 in the second round of Heat, I want to say N.
Maybe.
I think you.
It's either M or N. Yeah, thank you. So these fights are both really good shouts, and they're really enjoyable by Series 3 standards. I love the 101 King Buxton fight because it's got Vengeance, and I love Vengeance. It's always my favourite, except when the robots are called Eruption and Carbide. Vengeance is always a very exciting thing. And they're both really solid shouts, and the Thing 2 versus All Talk one is a really good shout as well. Were they close? I'm not really sure. Nick?
Good questions. Good fights. Interesting fights to discuss as well, because I think that the 101 King Buxton fight is comfortably the better of the two. All Talk Thing 2 has this... Sorry, Toast. Has this reputation, bizarrely, as being a really underrated fight. I've seen that comment multiple times because it's considered a really good driving match between two standard wedged machines. But on a rewatch, it's kind of a lot of buzzing around from both machines without either of them really dictating the battle fully. You get Thing 2 rearing up into All Talk's scoop a lot, and then a few head-to-head collisions where neither gains the upper hand, and it's kind of just, it hangs around the centre of the arena too much, and as much as it's good to see two quite fast-paced machines holding their own against each other in Series 3, it just doesn't do much. And that's why King B losing to 101, on the other hand, has more about it. You have so much of the arena used. I remember Shunt's axe getting stuck into King B having the hilarious joystick moment where it actually snaps off and Simon Harrison has to adjust. Both machines going over the flame pit near, I think it was Dead Metal.
You actually see 101's spike cause some damage.
Yeah, but both
That's
machines
rare.
have really, really notable slams and drives, and I think it is a real wild card shout to have it in the list, and it's one that gets, again, kind of drowned out by superior, or not even superior, but more visually damaging fights later on in the show's history, so it kind of can't do much to stand out unless there was like a dramatic pitting, which there couldn't be in the Series 3 Heat final. So,
and also the other Series 3 fights which got overshadowed.
yeah, and
Chaos 2 versus the Big Cheese,
absolutely.
Fight.
I think in terms of the fight being optimized, I think both these machines do about as much as they can to give it a chance on the list. So I can't discredit them. It just doesn't make it because everything else kind of hinders it. It's one of those things, and it's a good nomination. Good fight.
Yeah.
I enjoy it.
So thank you to Tasmanian Devilboy 42 and Alex the Hunted for those nominations.
Yep.
We also had another Series 3 nomination from Nick's sister, Cam Cam. She wanted Razorblade versus Red Dragon. In a word, no. So we're going to move on to Series 4 now for a much more contentious fight. And I'm going to hand straight back to surely the most qualified person in the world to talk about this fight. Take it away, Toon Ganondorf.
See, I thought you'd say the biggest person qualified to talk about this fight would be Nick, because, funny story, when we were all in the UK together earlier this year, Nick was asleep and Toast and I were awake, and we had to go out and get some things from the shops. And so what we did was, Nick was still in the middle of about episode 4 or 5 of the Ultimate Countdown. I can't quite remember which one was up to, but there was still room and there was still suspense. What's going to make the list? We're not up to that top 40 where we know there's no hope, there's no room for fights we love. So what I did was I put Dominator 2 versus 101 on replay, on loop, at volume, and we left. And by the time we got back, it had played about 30 times. Nick was awake by that point. But the idea was to subliminally hint to Nick, this is a great fight. This is a great fight.
Subliminally,
so he would put it on. Of course, I didn't really plan for what would happen when he woke up and he saw it. But, you know, we didn't think that far ahead. I'm not a scientist. So this fight is... everyone, you'll hear later on my love for Heavy Metal versus Mr. Speed Square. This is, though, the fight that I think is more about my objective view on the fight rather than my subjective love for the fight. I think this is 101's best fight ever. And that's a surprising thing because 101 has a fair decent number of victories. But this is the one that was the best because on paper, 101 had absolutely no business winning this fight. It was the 9th seed, but, you know, Shadow of Napalm was the 25th seed. Like, what does that even mean when you're up against a robot like Dominator 2? 101, despite having complete inoffensive weaponry and absolutely nothing to do, absolutely hurls itself at Dominator 2. It gives all the aggression it possibly can. Somewhat ironically, it kind of replicates the Tornado versus Anarchy aggression from a few years later, considering the robots involved. But I rewatched this fight last night in anticipation of recording, and I'm utterly convinced that 101 wins this fight on aggression and on the style criteria, which doesn't really mean much. It's a very large shame that they impale themselves on a spike, but the way there's that great moment of camera work where Dominator 2 is side on and 101 just like jumps and pushes Dominator 2. It's like absolutely running into the axe mechanism. And with a better weapon, maybe it could have done something. However, it was doomed to lose on damage, but this fight, I really urge everybody to go and watch it again because it's really, really terrific. Do not listen to Jonathan Pierce. Dominator 2 does not do all the aggression, they do all the damage. So, interesting to see how this fight would have been played if the robot had been called Cherub and this fight had been filmed in 2016. But nonetheless, it's a terrific, terrific fight, and I would have loved to see it in the top 100.
I mean, I don't think you can say 101 won on style. I don't know where that came from. By liberty of having an axe, Dominator can have that one. But, no, I mean, I agree. I wouldn't have a clue where to put it exactly on the list or if it had qualified at all, but I absolutely respect the fact that 101 is one of your favourite robots of all time, and you think its best performance and probably your favourite fight as well to feature it is a loss. But I can't dispute what you're saying. It is a great fight on those reasons. And ultimately, it's nice that Dominator does win because that's their first ever Heat win. I certainly wouldn't want to take the victory away from them. It's just a great fight to consume and enjoy.
It's one of the better Heat finals of series. In fact, I think it's probably the first really good Heat final of Series 4 because Atomic's barely working, Mortis is barely working, Razor's barely working, and the Morg, gets knocked out on controversy. So it's nice to see two really functioning, aggressive robots go the full distance and give us a really entertaining bout. One-sided, perhaps, but still really, really good shout. I would personally have loved to see it replace something like Firestorm versus Hypnodisc in the top 100. I wouldn't hold hopes for it being too high, but I really think it's definitely a top 100 in my opinion. Nick, any thoughts?
I'd certainly agree with you on that particular suggestion.
Yeah.
Nick, do you have any comments that aren't, sleep talking Jonathan Pierce quotes from this fight?
No, I don't.
No. I'm disappointed you don't know Jonathan Pierce quotes from this fight.
Use the toothpick at Christmas instead.
Look at that top, you can pour salt out of that.
But no, this is as you say, it's a fight that is very enjoyable. Two competent machines, both trying at the very least. We'll give 101 that credit. But yeah, it's one of many. I had this when I first started up the list. I had specifically like a Heat final segment, and there's fights like Dominator 2 Hydra in that category along with this one. So don't get me wrong, this fight was close to being right on the first part of the list, but Hydra does more to Dominator 2 than 101 does to Dominator 2, and that's why I forgot that fight.
I forgot that Hydra, Dominator 2 has a Heat final in the 90s. Could have easily swapped those around, couldn't you?
No.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I won't argue with that. But yeah, everyone knows which one of the two I would have had in the list. Feel free to let us know which Dominator 2 Heat final you guys like the best. The answer is not Corkscrew. All right. What's next on the agenda, Toast?
So I think we've got another really important Series 4 fight to move on to, but for completely different reasons. We've just had a fight which was really contentious, went all the way. This one absolutely didn't. But we definitely think there was probably room on the list for at least one example of a Razor destruction fight. Because we got it for Hypnodisc, we even got it for Carbide. Razor never quite got its opportunity, and we think probably the best home, if there was going to be one, would be the Millian Bug victory from Series 4. Not to discredit their melee over Robo Chicken and Velociriptor, because that's a brilliant showing as well. But Razor versus Millian Bug, something Nick would probably describe as cynical. I'd call it surgical, just to mix things up. This is just an example of an exhibition match for Razor, where they have got possibly the weakest robot in the entirety of round 2 against them, rivaled only by potentially Wheelosaurus.
I would say Nightmare, but that's just me.
Well, that counts as the weakest Heat finalist, just to give them a different title. But Razor vs. Billy and Bug, they could have just done anything they wanted to it. But this is really just one of those examples which shows why, in my opinion, Ian Lewis is probably the most competent driver in the whole of Robot Wars. It wasn't even a struggle for him to remove all 4 wheels off this robot individually, which is something you would actually do to a Bug in real life if you're a nasty person. Jonathan Pierce makes that connection. It's humanizing Razor in a sense, but it's also an extremely controlled win where if you're a Razor fan, this is the one for you. It's just doing whatever it likes.
Yeah, well, that's a funny thing, and it really underrated the accuracy. I think I'd struggle to remote control Razor from the view on my screen, but they're up in the control booth doing that. That's just awesome levels of precision.
And then it's not even a one-off in terms of driving ability. They just keep on doing it. They would investigate a robot in the pits, find out where their essential components are, then go in the arena from 3 feet above their robot's position on the ground, and then just go and pierce that exact moment, that exact location in their opponents and surgically KO them.
Yeah.
Razor, contested only by Michael Oates for me, for the potential best driver in the whole of Robot Wars. Does this fight have a chance of getting in the top 100? I think we've kind of covered already. If there was going to be a destructive Crusher fight, I think this is maybe the one. But it's just how a destructive Crusher fight stacks up against all of the good close fights and fights of other categories. Which I'm sure Nick can tell us.
Yeah, well, see, as this list has concluded and we've started to evaluate everything, I have obviously realised that I would have wanted that little bit more of a balance between showcasing multiple weapons at their finest. You always will have a spinner example, and 4 Shockwave can count as the Axe one, though it should have been Terahertz Smidsy as well. But yeah, absolutely, this fight is fantastic, and it's funny because it wasn't even considered at all as a candidate until TG just completely randomly predicted it for, was it a top 30 spot?
Top 20, top 30, 20, I think, yeah.
Top 20 or 30, yeah. And when I saw it there, I thought, well, that is an absolutely fantastic shout. There is nothing I can say to criticise this fight at all. It reminds me of Big Nipper Crackers and Smash in the way that it is absolutely optimised. There are so many ways that Razor could have just boringly ended this fight, and for a robot that is so oftenly labelled as exactly that, it just does the exact opposite and has the time of its life, and it is perfect, and I want to upload it as an infamous Robot Wars classic, but it's not even on the Ultimate Countdown. So, it's a shame. You want the most iconic robot in the show's history to have a fight like that to showcase itself, but it just didn't make the cut. And I'm not gonna try and cover up anything. I'm not gonna justify a fight being better than it. It just didn't get on there. It just filtered through. I don't think it should have, and that's a change I'd make on trying to balance this type of list out on a redo. But yeah, fantastic fight, showcases everything what Team Razor are about in terms of precision, and yeah, it's just incredibly enjoyable and worthy of a nomination at the very least for this part of the podcast. Let's try and give it that credit.
But certainly on the topic of precision, to close off the Series 4 section, we've kind of got another 2-in-1. And I think the best thing we can do to close off Series 4 is talk about the utter precision of Pussycat when it defeats Hypnodisc, and before that, defeats Dominator 2 in a wonderful fight as well. So, what do we think about the Pussycat fights? Because they're both remarkable in different ways. Even the Razor fight is notable just on the sheer shock factor and the infamy, but certainly not based on the combat.
No.
We have a fight against Dominator 2 where it genuinely is close. Dominator is actually landing hits on this tiny, slippery target, and full credit to that. But in the end, this little circular saw is genuinely causing damage, ripping a shell up from Dominator 2 and targeting its wheels like it's meant to do. And then certainly targets wheels for the Hypno Disc fight in a one-hit KO.
Not just any shell, it's a plasma nitrate coated titanium shell. So, there's that.
That they hadn't bolted down properly.
Yeah.
But it was...
That's true.
It looked notable,
Yeah.
especially at the time.
I don't think there's
So-
much to say about these fights. They're both terrific moments in a terrific campaign from Pussycat. I don't think they're anywhere near the top 100. That's all I've got to say about them.
Yeah, I think the question more is really which would you pick out of the two. I certainly know that Captain Skeen from Reddit would go for Pussycat Dominator 2 because that was his nomination in the first place. I think I would personally go for Pussycat Hypnodisc as the better one, just because it's an attack that could never be replicated ever again. Even if the same robots entered the arena again, which they did, and it didn't happen again.
I would probably pick Dominator 2 because it's a better fight. Dominator 2 contributes, whereas Hypnodisc doesn't really get a chance to. It sort of clips off I think it like bumps the blade and knocks off a caster, or I might be mixing that up with the Fluffy fight, but it sort of does glancing damage and then the fight's over because Shunt hits the disc. So it's a short, impressive moment, but that's all.
Yeah, these are both very, very solid nominations for different reasons. As we've said, we've got the 1 in a million factor for Pussycat Hypnodisc, and we've got the solid fight factor of the Dominator 2 one. On the Dominator 2 fight, unfortunately, I'm going to just play down Captain Skeen's nomination a little bit, because this fight is a good one, but at the same time, it's not great. Dominator 2, there seems to be some kind of a myth that it lands some blows in this fight, but in reality, its axe never works properly. It just hangs limply and fires limply, and all Dominator 2 can resort to is clamping down with the axe shaft a bit and trying to angle Pussycat into the CPZ. And Pussycat gets some glancing hits in before finally the most over-glorified bit of damage ever happens, because Dominator 2's shell visibly pops up when, in reality, it just slices through the armour a little bit. And then the rest is down to poor build quality. So that fight has too many holes in it for me. As solid as it is, I don't think it's quite there. But yeah, Pussycat Hypnodisc. I genuinely think this could have a shout for the random eye-catching opening 5 segment. Because, yeah, as we say, you want to give weight to 1 in a billion type fights, and this is definitely one of those. The fact that Hypnodisc's wheel isn't exactly visibly ripped off could hinder it, because it just kind of looks like a glancing blow, and then Hypnodisc gets killed off after that.
Very similar to the Razor one in Extreme 1.
Yeah, so whereas other 1 in a million moments, like, I don't know, Wheelie Big Cheese Axor as an eye-catching one, you know, you can see how impressive that truly is. Whereas Pussycat Hypnodisc, it isn't there truly on a visual level, as impressive as it is on a driving level. But it's a random outside candidate for those opening fights on the list, but yeah, I'm not sure I'd still give it that edge. I think I'd stick with or promote other types of fights that would come in that type of category, but it's a good one to discuss for sure.
I All right, we're a little bit behind my intended schedule, so we're going to pick up the pace quite a bit now. So follow my lead. Extreme 1. I think we've talked a little bit about Razor and Behemoth, which almost made the list. Nick, do you want to just give us a quick 30-second recap on that one?
Oh boy, yeah, this one was obviously here and featuring in the list along with Razor Behemoth from the First World Championships. I ended up cutting this fight completely for, oh goodness me, there was a fight that I added in. This was one of the...
S3 versus Shredder versus Armadillo versus Rhubarb was the replacement,
that's the one,
right?
Yeah, that is the one.
Which I think is a fair swap-ish, because I absolutely adore Shredder and S3's melee, and I was pleased to see it so high on the list. But at the same time, I was waiting and waiting for Razor versus Behemoth for Extreme 1 to come along, because it's a really fantastic fight, which basically repeats the First World Championship, loses a bit of spectacle, but in its change, it's even closer with 1 point in it on the judges, and Behemoth holds its lead even longer and just loses on damage yet again.
See,
if Behemoth had won this, I think this would definitely have been a top 40 fight, because it would have come straight after beating Hypnodisc, and then it would have been up against Firestorm, and that would have been an interesting fight that we never got to see. So
it certainly would have saved us from Razor running the gauntlet against Firestorm and Tornado again.
See,
And for the first time, but we'd get that later.
See, I think this fight, even though you say it's like a 1 point margin in the judge's decision, I don't think the edit does it justice. There are there are like 2 Behemoth lifts and 3 or 4 Razor crushes, so it's the edit that will kill the fight, if anything, in this case.
Because when I say it's a 1 point margin, that's not like me making that up. That's a genuine extract from the Razor website. Yeah. They said as much. It was that close. Do I think it should have been on the list? Yes. And the reason for that is because it was.
Yeah.
But something had to go. And I guess when you're already up to the top 50, that was probably one of the most sacrificial. So there's only really one other fight we want to talk about in detail for Extreme 1. There are plenty of good melees in there which could have been worthy of mention, like the Mayhem with Arnold A. Terminator and Wild Thing. There's the Flipper Frenzy. Plenty of fights in the Annihilator. Even Wolf of Winter's nomination of the tag team final. But I think the other most notable missing fight from Extreme 1 would be Firestorm 3 versus Wild Thing. What do we think about that one?
Has a very nice KO, and it's very notable for being a fairly standard Firestorm victory and a very standard Wild Thing. Give it everything you've got. If I think it probably could have squeaked onto the list, but I'm conscious of the fact that I just keep replacing things like Hypnodisc versus Firestorm 3 from the list, and I can't sub that off for everything that I would put on the list. So if I had to choose between putting this on and getting my way on something like Dominator 2 101, I'd probably sit this on the sideline. This could probably be, the next 10 or something like that. Close to greatness, but just misses out for the spectacles that you've got to fit on, like Panic Attack and Cassius.
Yeah. It's a good fight to nominate. I know a couple of people have been quite passionate about it should have been on the list. But
such as Crash Bash Killdozer.
But at the same time, I'm not entirely convinced that this should be as highly rated by the general audience as it is. Wild Thing taking an early lead of the fight probably glorifies it a bit too much, when in reality it's kind of knocking Firestorm around in the centre of the arena a bit without actually using the arena itself. So it's one of those where Wild Thing smothers Firestorm but without truly dictating the fight, and then Firestorm gets that flip in and it's over. So, yeah, it's not expansive enough use of the arena by Wild Thing to push this fight away from being a solid fight a la All Talk Thing 2 into a truly proper solid contender that would comfortably fit on the list. So
it'd be funny, let's just take a quick segue. Does anyone know off the top of their head how many Wild Thing fights were Toast, how many Wild Thing fights were on the Ultimate Countdown?
So we had six Wild Thing fights on the list.
And I reckon there's probably another 4 that were close. Firestorm, Arnold A, All Talk, 259. And they're just the 4 that I can list off the top of my head. So that sort of just goes to show Wild Thing, consistently a solid entertainer, but ever a bridesmaid.
Especially because 6 appearances means that Wild Thing was actually in 5th place overall for most appearances on the countdown. And especially when you consider the sheer number of fights that it could have had and very nearly did, then yeah, it would be up there in the very upper echelon.
It would have come second by my count. Unless there's one more that I haven't mentioned, and that puts it in joint first with Bearmoth. So, interesting. All right, let's move on to Series 5. The biggest omission, in my opinion, in fact, I think the only omission in Series 5 is Hypnodisc versus Atomic. And I think we've already covered this in pretty decent detail. So let's just talk quickly about the low quantity of good quality Series 5 fights. There's so many that are in the upper tier, like Chaos 2 Wild Thing, Bigger Brother Hypnodisc, the S3 Losers Melee. But overall, there's so many that are just crap.
Yeah. Series 5 showing the fact that it has incredible peak fights, some of the best in the entirety of Robot Wars, but as an entire padded out series, there isn't truly much there in terms of a balance.
Like, I think of your solid middle-of-the-road fights would be your King Bee fights versus Chronic and Dominator 2, both, like, okay, but they're never going to get close to the top 150. And so they're like the decent ones. The crap ones, that's when you get, like, the double breakdowns and you get the Napalms versus Warhogs and you get the, Rick versus Destructor Bubbles and that sort of stuff. No one enjoys those, so I don't think there's a whole lot missing. There was a pair of shouts. There was a shout for Chaos 2 Bigger Brother, which I think is a better shout than I initially gave it credit for. I get it mixed up with Dan Tom Kia. But I think as we discussed on the Chaos 2 podcast, we won't go into detail. That fight is a little bit sad because you know that Chaos 2 would have won that had they kept the Series 4 pace that they used to have. In Series 5, they had so much power straight off the gun and then they died so easily. And ultimately, Chaos 2 being unable to self-right's not that much fun, even if it is the dethroning of the reigning champion. I don't think anybody actually expected Chaos 2 to win a third title.
And it's kind of in that position where it's not even Bigger Brother's best flipper fight. They've had other, like, for example, the Firestorm fight. So thanks to Rabid Frosties for that suggestion. I don't think it was in contention for the top 100, but it's absolutely a great moment to throw in Series 5. We've also got a really bad moment from Series 5, which was just in the middle of what was setting up to be a top 100 contender. And that's Noob Sailor RBH's nomination of Pussycat versus Fluffy. Could we bear to have such a heartbreaking moment in the top 100 fights of all time?
No, and in fact, I wouldn't even have it in the top 200. Sorry, Noob Sailor, I don't want to be
I wouldn't
upsetting,
either.
But this fight and the next fight on our list, which I'll flag now so that we don't have to go into detail of it, which is Dan Tom Kia versus Chaos 2, are both just really disappointing, falls of titans, and that's all they are. They're moments that happen, like Dan Tom Kia's out of the arena flip on Chaos 2 and Fluffy's decapitation of Pussycat, but ultimately, and for different reasons, the fights are just so unremarkable because once you take out those two moments, there's nothing else to discuss except for Chaos 2 flipping itself into a CPZ and unable to self-right, and Fluffy breaking down. Neither of those are particularly fun.
Yeah, I think Toast basically summarised it best there. these Pussycat Fluffy, but also Danton Kid Chaos 2, they could have shaped up to be top 100 fights. Let's say if if Fluffy tore Pussycat limb by limb, continued going as it started, and then we saw an All-Star completely wrecked, then that would be right up there. And if Danton Kia won a back and forth flipper fight, that would be in there. But these are just an opportunistic Uta on a robot which is stuck at an angle and can't self-right, and a robot breaking down after such an incredible moment. So the flaws are too much, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I don't think they were ever in contention. So, Series 6, that one's out of the way. The biggest miss in Series 6 and Extreme 2, I think, is where we're going to find the guts of the missing fights. These are our big moments now. So we're going to give a bit more time here. The biggest miss, and we actually forgot to talk about it somehow during our detailed analysis of Terahertz, is Terahertz versus Panic Attack 24 Karat Gold.
We literally had a section of the previous episode entirely about terahertz fights, and we managed to miss that off. It's been omitted twice now from the real list and from the backup podcast.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing about this fight is it's basically Terahertz Smidzy, but then you get even more value from it because you get the brilliant humour with Kim Davis trying to escape the drop zone and the like. So you can claim this as even more worthy than Terahertz Smidzy, which should have been a guarantee in itself. So yeah, fantastic fight, should have been on the list. Matilda gets the entire top panel Uta. There's so much
There's
there.
some great,
the drop zone.
Yeah, there's some great context in that Terahertz, who has been Terahertz/Kilohertz, who have been crap for so long in the UK, and they finally win a heat, and they do it by beating a former champion. Even though that former champion is Panic Attack Gold, there's some nice, it represents a lot, and that's what makes it such an enjoyable fight for me.
Yeah.
So, would have been a solid shout. I reckon it probably could have ranked in the 70s or 60s very easily.
Absolutely, I think that's perfect.
Yeah, it's a shame. So there you go.
But I do still think that Smidzy is a bigger priority, just based on the greater visual damage from the axe itself, the manic pace, and it was just the classic example of an axe destruction fight.
You know what? I could have very easily had those two back to back, and as I'm looking at the list again now, I could have very easily had them sub out, Wild Thing Prize Fighter and squeeze them into the 50s there.
I think that's a bit of a reach. Wild Thing Prize Fighter. I think you'd...
Well, how about Wild Thing... Sorry, not Wild... Yeah, so drop Wild Thing Prize Fighter, go back down then and look more like Wild Thing
Trouble and Strife you were looking for.
Could have been... that's probably a better
I can agree with.
Shout.
But I already brought that up in overrated, so
Yeah.
I know that I have an agenda.
But I
against
think
that one.
50s and 60s is a safe place for both of these fights. It's a shame that they missed out, but at the end of the day, Nick might finally be coming around that Terahertz is not his favourite because two of its most famous wins were dropped from the list altogether.
Now, speaking of favourite robots that didn't make it on the list, oh man, Series 6 Heat D was just one of the greatest episodes of all time. Both of its melees did get on the list. We've got Shredder versus the Alien in there, which was never going to get on, but it's a personal favourite of mine. I just enjoy it. But both of the S3 head-to-head wins are enjoyable for such different reasons. And we got S3 Sacromalot, where again it's probably not quite of the quality to make it in the top 100, but it's again a uniquely enjoyable experience that just reminds you of playing Robot Wars Extreme Destruction in the endurance round. We have never, unless you count like TR2 versus Carbide at the end, we've never seen such a clear example of one robot trying to bait someone else into driving in the pit. And it's just so typical of Steve Merrill. And then it does obviously end with some big S3 blows. And there's some near pit dramas of just driving past it. It's great for a laugh. But then even better than that was the Heat final, S3 versus Shredder. Because we know these two robots can face off to such a high quality that it gets on the list. Because it did the first round melee. And we put them together in a 1v1, and it's not nearly as close, but it's so novel and enjoyable, where Shredder just keeps coming back for more. It channels its inner Cheong Jin Lun from King of Bots, basically.
It channels something from like 5, 6, 10 years later.
In the sense that it just doesn't die. It keeps taking massive blows from S3, and then the only way in which it was immobilized is by having its frame bent up so badly that Shredder becomes pinned on its own bent chassis. And then as soon as it's counted out and flipped back into play, it just rams its face straight back into S3's disc again. It's already lost, but it just wants to keep beating itself up, and then the house robots completely fail to do so, and S3 just pits itself out of pity. I honestly thought it was going to be a wildcard shout in the top 100, and I would try and squeeze it in if it was my list. But, was it close, Nick?
Yeah.
Great.
I don't know what more I can say about this fight, though, because although there's not much missing from it, at the same time, and I don't know why this is the case, but it just doesn't quite have something to make it truly hold an automatic spot of, say, yeah, this is definitely in the 70s or the 60s or the 50s or whatever. It just feels like a fight that doesn't have a specific spot, and so I probably didn't give priority to it, and that's why it then ended up dropping lower and lower on my list of fights that I thought, yep, that has to be there, that's there, that's there. And this fight kind of, as good as it is, it doesn't really manage to have that true identity of where it could be in a segment. Like, as I said, I don't think I can discredit anything about this fight, even if I said, oh, well, I would have preferred, say, the disc that came off in the melee to have come off here as extra visual damage, but then the entire chassis is warped, so you get an example of that when it's flipped over. So, yeah, I don't really know what to say to discredit this one.
That's positive enough for me, so we can instead move on. And we've already mentioned that Heat D in particular had some great melees. Series 6 in general had some great melees, and there's plenty that could be talked about. Say, for example, the one won by Exterminator versus Barbaric Response, or the one won by Chronic 2 and Panic Attack. But
or the one won by Barbarous 2 and Hypnodisc.
Oh yeah, for TG. The one we actually had nominated by Jack from Discord was Firestorm 4's melee against Megahertz 2, Colossus and Cedric Slammer. Personally, for me, it's not in contention just because Firestorm picking on Cedric Slammer annoys me too much, but I appreciate how every single one of the 4 robots dies at some point. It's a good laugh.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't even put it above the Exterminator melee from the same episode personally.
I think it's a solid shout, and I do rate it higher than the Exterminator melee, but I don't think it was in contention for the top 100. It was probably in the 120s mark for me. I really enjoy the visual attacks on Cedric Slammer and Megahertz. They both look terrific, and they're both really, really well done. But any fight that includes Colossus loses points for me, because it's just so boring.
I think if Firestorm, say, took one of its Commonwealth Carnage ooters and put them in here, then that could basically seal the spot, a place of this fight on the list. But
get Colossus out of the arena instead of Bondi
Colossus
Titch.
Is...
Yeah, let's say...
Yeah, Colossus is basically the same shape as Bondi
and
Titch.
let's say
or even Weldor 3. There's just a wedge.
Yeah. And let's say if Firestorm actually pushed Colossus over the wall or something, then that would be great. Like, you can't discredit the Megahertz one because its entire fucking head explodes.
Yeah, it's great. It looks great.
Yeah, there's just something missing there, and it was probably something like an Uta, but it's a very good fight.
So yeah, that's that one wrapped up. And then as we hit the hour mark, let's talk about one of the most famous Series 6 robots, as far as, that's such a Series 6 robot. Let's talk about surprisingly missing from almost, I think, the entire countdown, 259.
It was, yes.
Not a single appearance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was being very careful in that Melee's discussion to not mention what was in fact the single most cheated Melee in the whole of the Series 6 or 7 to not get on. I absolutely think that 259's debut against Agrabot 3, Infernal Contraption Infinity, is one of the best Melees in Series 6. I think it's better than the one that was won by Thor and Anarchy, which did get on the list. And I also think it's better than the one which was won by Razor and Raging Reality, which got on the list.
Yeah.
So I would
And that's
put
a
this
lot
fight
coming from
above
somebody
both of
who
them,
worships Ooters. That's a lot coming from Toast.
which means to me that 259's Melee is comfortably on the list, and it got the shaft.
Yeah. It just did. It just did. Again, it's like one of these fights like Razor Millian Bug that nobody makes a case for until they realise it's not there randomly. So, in a case, it doesn't really announce its name despite being a really great fight. What stops this fight? Infinity killing itself and Agrobot doing literally nothing. Still should be on the list, but those two are a waste of space. It's just basically 259 versus Infernal Contraption, let's be honest.
I'll have you know that Agrabot 3 does overturn Infernal Contraption using its wedge shape.
You mean Infernal Contraption inverts itself?
Yeah, I can absolutely attest to what you said about nobody notices until it's already gone.
Yeah.
I wasn't waiting for this fight or anything, but it's only when I've realised that there were 4 Series 6 Melees in the whole list, and this wasn't one of them, I then realised, you mean to tell me that this is barely even in the top 5 Melees from Series 6 alone? Because I disagree. And I would have put
the last
this in.
two on the list? The last 2 Series 6 Melees, besides the 2 you mentioned.
The Smidsy Melee
of course.
and the GBH
Yeah, the two
Melee.
really good ones. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But then it just gets
Worse and worse.
Because there was another 259 fight in the same episode, which I would just go as far as to say was missed off by mistake.
Again, though, it's one that bizarrely nobody pointed out again until the list was done. So it was completely criminal by me to miss it out, but I wasn't even...
Yeah. We weren't even thinking about it until it had a Reddit nomination.
From the 100 to the 60 odd section, I'm fine with, or even up to the mid 40s, I was fine with cutting fights and subbing ones in. If I was reminded of this fight, it would have been in there. But everyone forgot it existed.
And then Wild Thing would be on 7 appearances in the list.
Yep.
Because like we say, it was omitted by mistake,
Yeah.
so it should have been in joint 4th place with Hypnodisc.
It's an utterly fantastic fight, and it's even a case of where a limp breakdown only makes the fight better. So, yeah, like it's a sad moment.
So you could say that rather than being a limp breakdown, it was just a breakdown.
Oh, no.
Wild Thing survived. It came back. It just kept coming back. Because that sequence of 259 hits is worth the breakdown. Like, if I had to choose between a less interesting fight that 259 won and the fight that we got, I'd choose the fight that we got. Because it's just awesome.
The breakdown adds to it because it's random drama at the end of the fight. So it's not...
And it's credit for Wild Thing. It's like all credit for Wild Thing for building a robot durable enough to take all those hits.
It's
That's
a fight
not a discredit.
It's a fight that perfectly summarises what both machines are about. It's great.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, and then, well, while we're on 259, let's talk about Extreme 2 and the 259 bracket middleweight closed bracket fights.
Well, you say 2. I don't think the final is really in contention, where it just gets turned over by Typhoon. Steel Sandwich gets 3rd place in a domestic championship, for heaven's sake.
Steel Sandwich?
But I mean... It's amazing enough that we just have to breeze past its UK versus Germany fights as a heavyweight, where it has a brilliant fight with Judge Shred, rips it up, and
Oh,
then
those-
breaks
sorry.
down and nearly loses.
Those were the 259 fights I was thinking of, sorry. Not the
Yeah.
Extreme 2 ones.
Well played.
I mean, I'm perfectly happy to talk about an underrated middleweight shout where Doom 2 gets utterly ruined and Mammoth gets chased by Dead Metal. Typhoon Twins are there, I guess. But yeah, it's probably more important to talk about 259 versus Fluffy.
Yes.
That one hurts. That one just like, you look at it and it just hurts to watch. Like
Yeah.
you flinch when they make contact. You know that 259 is going to come off second best, but it's so violent.
Yeah, exactly. We've had up until this point in Series 6, Robot Wars had started to bring in some really solid spinners, but this is like the first true proper occasion where you can truly feel the energy behind a hit. It feels high energy, high impact. And the way that 259 just completely folds up and flips over, it is so good. And Fluffy coming in on the turn as well. It's not just like they meet head on and 259 falls backwards. It's a complete both of them meeting at an angle and both of them just flying in opposite directions. So yeah,
So, spoilers, if Nick ever does a top 25 foreign fights, this also aired in the German series, so it can just be number 1.
Yep, perfect. Nicely done.
It's not appeared in the Ultimate Countdown, so it can appear in the foreign countdown.
that's how I make amends.
That's what he was saving
Yeah.
it for.
He was letting it breathe by leaving it off.
So yeah, that pretty much closes off 259's campaign. No greater need to talk about its 2 encounters with the Typhoon Twins. Although, I do think it's notable that one half of the Typhoon Twins, Typhoon Thunder, features in my 14th favourite battle of all time against Ellie's Little Pink Bot in Extreme 2,
Staggering.
in one of the funniest battles of all time. But I think if I continue this train of thought, then I'm just going to get burnt alive for it. So just leave it as, yeah, I would want it in the top 100, but I can't argue it against these powerful presences. So for Extreme 2, the proper beginning, we've got to move on to what was, I would say, third place in terms of maybe not necessarily most obviously omitted, but this fight received, I would think, the most nominations. So I guess with Chaos 2 versus the Big Cheese and later on a certain other very obviously omitted fight, people kind of took it for granted that we talk about it in the podcast, so they weren't mentioned as much. But to name a few, we've got Jack Simpson, Noob Sailor RBH, Daniel Grashoff, James24, all campaigning over the absence of Firestorm 4 versus Dan Tomkier.
I am sorry, you four, but I still will not budge. I think I made the right call on this one. This is basically Chaos 2 Bigger Brother, where it's great action for the first, say, minute or so. Bit longer in this fight than the Series 5 semi-final one. But, yeah, it's very similar to Bigger Brother Firestorm, where one robot is dominant, but eventually gets ground down, so to use one of my famous phrases. But in the Bigger Brother fight, Bigger Brother fails to stealth right after expending loads of CO2 in what is basically like a 3-minute fight in the edit. Whereas here, unfortunately, Dan Tomkier has one of those random moments where something inside of it malfunctions and it stops working, and the way it stops working, it isn't even flipped over and can't self-right or anything like that, where you can try and excuse it, say it's run out of CO2 or something like that. No, it just falls back down to earth and grinds to a halt in such a sad way, and it just makes the fight, which was so fast-paced and energetic, just completely lose all momentum from that and that alone, unfortunately.
It's pretty funny. I mean, there was a very obvious reminder about this fight because every single opening credits of the original opening credits featured this fight. So it was in everyone's mind, and then of course when it didn't appear, I'm not surprised that it's been heavily requested. My personal views on this fight, The action is amongst some of the best flipper-on-flipper action we've ever had, but the breakdown is also one of the most disappointing breakdowns we've ever had because it just happens right in the throes of it.
Exactly.
It's kind of like what was that one we were talking about before? Well, it's kind of like 259, really. It just stops. It's like you were on top. You weren't on top, but we're right in the middle of the and it just sort of. It's done. It's over.
It's
it's
a bit
stopped.
different here.
Fluffy,
and it's a
especially.
bit different here as well because 259 breaks down when it's technically still done enough to win the fight. Whereas here, you're waiting for Danton Kia to... it just got a flip in on Firestorm about 30 seconds before it stopped working. And you think, is this comeback on? This fight is really building up to be an all-time classic. Then Danton Kia is in the CPZ again, and it's just getting better and better. And then it ends, and you're just like, no, why? This could have been so brilliant, but now you've ruined yourself. So, yeah, it's a shame.
Yeah, it's a worthy enough cut. I think the only part that stands out for me is that there is such a gaping distance between Firestorm's wins over Danton Kia and Bigger Brother, because when you break them down, they're very similar in a way. Bigger Brother, of course, being the better fight. The fact that they are at minimum 50 places apart is a little odd, but I think we've justified it well enough there. I'm going to have to try a lot harder now to justify...
No.
I can't even look at myself. Yes. It's time for Toast to wax lyrical. So,
God.
there is one fight which has somewhat become synonymous with my hipster opinions, as it were, and general tastes in robot fights. There is one fight which I had been campaigning to be on the top 100 from its infancy right until the top 10 came out, and absolutely no one agrees with me. And I know that when talking about this fight, yes, it's definitely a personal pick, and this is meant to be an objective list. But when a fight manages to be your 6th favourite fight of all time, it must be doing something right. I am, of course, talking about ICU versus Chopper versus Mad Dog. Just one of the most comical fights of all time. I absolutely adore it. When when Nick and TG came over to my flat in Middlesbrough, does somebody want to tell that story to give people a brief relapse from my voice?
We picked a random episode to watch, as a free. We got this episode. The fight started.
When you say random,
it was.
What exactly do you mean by random?
Random page on the wiki, and of course it ended up with this episode, because of course it did. Basically, this fight's the first in the episode. TG fell asleep shortly after. I had it confirmed that this fight was even less deserving than the wild card place on the list. But at the side, Toast is still buzzing like a little Christmas child, isn't he?
I came to like it even more.
What is wrong with
because
you?
Every time you think the fight has run its course and it's run out of comedy, it just throws something else in there.
Don't get me wrong.
It bloody starts by Chopper just driving straight into Matilda's flywheel and getting blown the frick apart. It's already incompetent because ICU's weapon's dead and Mad Dog's doing nothing. Then Chopper just parks on the flame pit for a good 30 seconds and catches fire with seemingly no intention of leaving.
I mean, it has some great action behind it. At the end of the day, Chopper is an utter shithouse. Matilda is completely cynical. And ICU allows the fight to breathe because it gives Chopper the limelight. So, it has so
I was going to say, all you have to do, Nick, is slip in precision mill and ground down. You've got like the full 5 holy commandments of Nick commentary.
At the end of the day, Mad Dog is then ground down, so it should have everything I like in a fight. But I think it's one of those where it's so good that I just want Toast to pedestalize it. I don't want to give it too much praise myself, or it'll be mainstream.
Well, good, because I can carry on, because I'm not even halfway through my list of bullet points.
No, you've had it. You've had enough. You've had enough. Let's move
While
on.
Mad Dog dies, Chopper just drives straight in the wall. ICU nearly drives in the pit. Matilda absolutely carves into Mad Dog and rips it up. The floor flipper throws Mad Dog onto Matilda. Sir Kill-Lot's breastplate falls off. The drop zone misses. And then it's just got my favourite Jonathan Pierce line of all time, where, well, Chopper came out here with one thing in mind. Let's get mullered. Let's get absolutely massacred. Let's do our very, very worst. It's perfect. I would change nothing about this beautiful fight.
Unfortunately, Toast, I think there's a compromise here now. With you wasting 40 minutes talking about this fight, we're going to have to scan over a couple of one of your favourite Machines fights in mute. Still going to give it a bit of an overview, but you know.
I mean, New Blood was an interesting sort of tournament itself, and we had sort of a section set aside for discussing what's the best fight of New Blood, because there's a couple of nominations for Mute v Rhubarb and Mute v Storm 2, and I think there was another one, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was Mute versus Mr. Nasty.
Mr. Nasty,
yeah. Just because of purely the Sergeant Bash versus Refbot encounter and not because of the fight itself. The fight itself is underrated. Mute gets plenty of flips and that shouldn't have been ignored. But I wouldn't get rid of the Sergeant Bash malarkey just to focus on Mute fighting Mr. Nasty.
I don't think there's a whole lot needs to be said about these. What's your vote for best, Nick? We already know what Toast's is.
Do we?
Yes.
Well, apart from ICU's.
Well, that's your answer. So, Nick, what's yours?
A best New Blood fight? I don't know. I really don't know. There's a lot of fights with good value in all of them, but I don't think there's an outright, truly top quality fight at the same time. So, I'm honestly not sure.
I'd probably just say Mute v Rhubarb, but I don't think it was close to being on the list.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Alright, some other Extreme 2 shouts, which we've lost some time with the blow-by-blow description of Mad Dog versus ICU vs Chopper, which was somewhat unnecessary, because Nick will be playing footage of the fight during the conversation, but anyway. So there was some shout-outs for Firestorm's European Championship melee, which is...
He's done it again!
No, that's what... Oh, sorry. Commonwealth Carnage melee. I wrote down... I don't know why I wrote down
It's
European.
got an Australian robot in it as well, and he's calling
You're not pinning Bondi Titch on us, I'll tell you that right now. That was a loner bot.
Okay.
Anyway, so Firestorm's Commonwealth Carnage melee has some good ooters. Corkscrew gets a couple of good whacks, but that's really all it is. It's Firestorm's participation trophy, really, and that's all it is. It's nice to see it excel. There's also a good shout for Dan Tom Kia's Challenge Belt melee, which I think we've covered already. We sort of touched on it last episode. Some good touches for Bigger Brother Tornado, which we've already discussed. Terahertz, Dan Tom Kia and Tornado, which is a really, really good fight. Probably could have been in contention in the 120s, 110s. Maybe?
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think that Dan Tomkia Tornado Terahertz is an immediately incredible match to watch because of the most miraculous Uta recovery, even more so than Mute Rhubarb and other similar ones. But it loses a lot of points on a rewatch because it's got that one moment, otherwise it's Terahertz getting ganged up on by the reigning champion and a flipper when it hardly has the use of its own axe. So it deserves a lot of credit, but it's not a rewatchable fight. Really.
Funnily enough, it's actually better. It's a lot better than the next time that Terahertz and Tornado would fight, and it's probably better than the time that Terahertz beats Dan Tom Kia in the same year. So,
despite that being a much more solid shout.
The biggest omission for me from Extreme 2, and there was a lot from Extreme 2 that I really like. I love almost the entire Extreme 2 tag team, but the biggest omission for me was Black Hole and Zeus. This fight was one of the first fights I saw, from Extreme 2, and I just put it on. I said I'd never heard of either of these two robots, and then holy crap, it just starts, and Black Hole is just... It's channeling Aftershock versus Cranky before that was a thing. It's just, and Zeus is by no means a terrible robot. It's probably like a solid 5, 6 out of 10. But Black Hole absolutely just smacks it around like you wouldn't believe. It's a delightful little fight. There was a couple of shouts on Discord for this one being missed out throughout the list because we all knew that it wasn't going to make it early on. I would have loved to see it be probably in the first, either the 90s or the 80s. Obviously, the fact that Zeus does absolutely nothing has to hold it back. But it's sad for me that the only Black Hole fight on the list is the one that it loses at the last second. And we don't get to see the Black Hole win, which is so much more entertaining.
But at least when Nick does his top 25 foreign fights or whatever, sorry, Fluffy versus 259, you've already lost your title because it's basically the home for any European Championship fight which didn't make it onto the actual top 100. So the beauty of Black Hole versus Zeus can get on instead. I love this fight. Would have been very happy to see it in the top 100. I understand why it's not there, which I'll let Nick go through himself because it was his list. But, I would have happily seen it on there. It's a brilliant fight.
No, it's a fantastic fight. And although it was kind of like a passionate debate at the time as to me holding firm over it not being on there and you guys really wanting it on there, I think I made the right call for most of the fights to outdo it. But yeah, I think it has a place, definitely. There's a few fights we've seen as disposable. And there is some real nice feeling after, seeing all these local English robots or whatever competing on the show for 90% of the time. You then have 2 random unknown foreign machines and you get so much power coming out from one of them from nowhere. So it truly is a fight that holds its own and it's very enjoyable. It's just one of those where you have so many destructive fights that I gave too much priority to solely Hypnodisc, so it is what it is. But no, it's a fantastic fight.
Alright, so we're an hour and 22 minutes, so we really want to pick up the pace for these last few series.
I think
there's not a whole lot from Series 7, considering there was so much of Series 7 on the list. The one, I'll quickly dispose of a shout for Judge Shred 3 versus Mute. For me, this is way too... It is! I have to. It's too controversial to be on it. It's not the best one there.
Well,
it's too controversial.
That's one of my favourite fights.
Alright, well, have your say. Come on, have your say.
I think I'll just butt in.
Mute versus Judge Shred 3 is just a thing of
toast.
beauty.
I don't want your blood pressure to get too high, mate. So I think I'll just quickly come in and actually back you up here. I conceded to Toast last night, or the night before, whenever it was, that I would have put this on the list now. I think it's good enough.
Thanks,
yeah.
Man.
I rate the theatrics of the self-writing because it doesn't take away from the fight. It just makes it even more fun. And yeah, it is a very drawn out but still content filled fight. I like it a lot. And why?
And ends with a close judge's decision, just to top it all.
And why
off.
didn't I put it on there?
Every single aspect of this fight
Why
is
didn't
enjoyable.
I put it on there in the first place? Probably because I tried to discount comedy in the early stages of the list, as I've hinted at before. So yeah, but no, really good fight. Don't want to dwell on it too long, but I do think I made the wrong call on that one.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Look, I think it's good. Don't get me wrong. I was just trying to be brief rather than dismissive. I think it's great. I think it's one of those ones where the TV edit doesn't do it justice.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
I think Mute is done a real disservice because I think that there was probably a lot more that we didn't see.
Yeah, absolutely.
To justify that judge's decision. But yeah, it would have been great to see Judge Shred on the list aside from, it losing to Thor and Anarchy. But, let's talk about the big elephant in the room. And that was the April Fool's Day video.
Oh boy.
Which I believe included Storm 2 versus Firestorm 5. So naturally, everybody except for me, when the actual 30 to 20 came out, and everyone pretty much said, I think those 3 or 4 are pretty much set in stone, I said, I don't think they are. And sure enough, Storm 2 versus Firestorm 5 was a red herring that did not ever appear on the list.
No.
Let's talk about that, Nick.
Yeah, no, you read what I was doing there the whole time, and it's great. A lot of people find this a controversial cut, and I understand why, especially with Tornado Firestorm 4 being in there as in its place as such. But I think that I wouldn't include either if I redid the list, actually.
Really?
Yeah, I would stand firm on this one, and to be fair, I would also drop the Firestorm 4 Tornado one, because as I said last episode, I mainly brought into the reputation of that fight from the community as a whole, rather than it being truly top tier. Like, they're both good fights with content there, and good pittings, but it's Firestorm against a precision milled wedge. It's always going to be hard for the fight to truly excel. So yeah, I don't
steel
think
strip
either of
or
them are
not.
quite good. Yeah, steel strip or not.
I think the only real thing you can do to truly summarize this place in terms of its inclusion on the list is the fact that nobody called it out whatsoever in the April Fools. It just started off.
Exactly.
And nobody said it was wrong. Nobody said, oh, that shouldn't be there in the real version of the video.
That's why I did it.
Even when people realised it was an April Fool's video, that was still expected to be there at 30, and it wouldn't have felt out of place. And yet it's not on the 100.
Well, that's the thing. I didn't want to start the April Fool's episode with, say, the 10 Robot Rumble, because it kind of feels a little bit weird from the off, whereas this fight, it's just like, yep, that's completely expected. Good start to the 30 to 21 section.
Fine,
Yeah, so that's
belongs
why I did
there.
it. Good fun.
Well done. Well played. I didn't... Where credit's due, I didn't actually pick this one as being the red herring. I was just mostly adamant that the 10 Robot Rumble would be higher than it was on the April Fool's video, which I was right about, but in hindsight probably shouldn't have been right about, because as discussed last week, I think the 10 Robot Rumble has become a little bit overrated. But nonetheless, let's move on. Series 7, just a couple of other shouts. There were some great melees. We'll never be able to fit them all in. Seros's, Steel Avengers, IG-88s, Dantom Kias, Tough as Nails. There's tons of them. You could fit almost every Series 7 melee on the list, I think, somewhere. I'm trying to think of any of the bad ones off the top of my head. Raging Nightmares isn't good, but, there's a lot of great ones. If I was to pick one, I would pick Tough as Nails', just because I love it so much. I think it was actively missing from the list. If you were to pick one more melee, what would you pick, Toast?
Objective level, I would go with the Trax and Steel Avenger one. Personal favourite being Mute and Judge Shred, but that's just
I
me.
would go with the Steel Avenger one, or as we hinted at previously, the Dutch melee for the World Championships. That still counts.
Yes. That still counts too. That is a delightful fight. Also should have been on the list. But
yeah, well then you have to count Storm 2 versus Ansgar 3 as well.
Well, no, we don't have to. That wasn't close. Alright, and then we're going to give a brief mention here to Typhoon 2 versus Hammerhead 2, which was actually Gary Cairns' favourite fight. And it's interesting enough when you consider that it was actually very similar to Typhoon 2 versus Iron Ore 2.1, which was on the list. This was not on the list. And one's the Roboteer in question's favourite, and the other one isn't. And the other one that isn't is on the list. Nick, do you want to give us some insight onto your thought process?
Yeah, I don't want to discredit Gary at all, because I'm sure he has his reasons, but that reason mostly will probably be because it's the first time Typhoon 2 worked at its full potential, rather than truly being the best fight. They are similar destruction fights, but they are also pretty different at the same time. When you think of the Iron Ore 2.1 fight, you can think of 3 or 4 occasions where Iron Ore's completely flung across the arena. Whereas here, it kind of starts off slow for the first 10-15 seconds, then Typhoon gets in a chunky but not truly slashing hit. Hammerhead 2 randomly loses drive after one of these solid but not destructive hits, and then it's just a spinning on the circle target for Typhoon to wreck and pick off what it wants to. It targets those panels, it rips them off because it can, whereas in Iron Ore, it keeps coming back, it keeps getting wrecked more, and then it gets killed off.
Yeah.
So
And there's always hope, because we know that Typhoon 2 can be beaten by being flipped.
Yeah.
When you're watching it, you just hold out hope, just get one flip, come on, just get one flip.
yeah,
And it never happens. Whereas Hammerhead, we knew they were never going to win.
yeah, Hammerhead just seizes up its drive, and that kills things off, unfortunately.
Alright, so now we're on to the reboot, and we're at an hour 30, so we're going to try and do all of this within 15 minutes.
Should do.
Or hopefully less. Let's talk about, I'm going to list all the reboot nominations in one go, and then we'll talk about them rather than doing series by series, just for the sake of brevity. So, starting with a quick shout for Pulsar v Gabriel from Nick. Any comments you want to make quickly?
Comment as in, this was actually very high in the original draft. I can't remember the specific spot. I don't know if Toast has it, but it was 30 upwards because it was such a close judge's decision. I think it got over-glorified in my mind because so many of the reboots heat finals before Series 10, when this draft was initially made, were very poor. So this fight stood out. But when I got to it, and as the list drew on, I thought, yeah, this doesn't really hold its own outside of being a solid Series 8, Series 9 heat final. So that was that. But yeah.
I think I'd probably rank it below Ironside versus Gabriel, to be honest. Or even if not below, that it was just a very similar rehash of that fight. So I didn't feel that much suspense. So I think you made the right call there.
No. I disagree,
okay.
but that's all.
Carbide v Behemoth in the head-to-head was a really good shout. Toast and I both rewatched it just before we started recording. Really solid fight, a really good barreling hit from Behemoth, a really good crippling hit from Carbide, and then a pitting, of which we did not get nearly enough in the reboot. So that was a really good shout. Any comments?
Yeah, Carbide also had the fight against Nuts for its debut, which was another fantastic destruction fight. And I think
Shout out to Beaver.
I think,
that was yours.
and I think one of these two fights should have probably made the list as a iconic Carbide fight. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard to
Yeah,
pick
absolutely.
one, but at the same time, I already did, because when myself and TG were both making our predictions for the top 30 of the list, I genuinely had Carbide Behemoth in there.
It was like Toast
in the 20 to 30
It was Toast's
region.
version of Razor versus Millian Bug. We both had these shouts that none of the other one of the three of us had thought of. So, yeah, and it wasn't until today that I actually acknowledged it was a really good shout.
Yep.
So yeah, good shout there, and yeah, the Nuts one, curb stomp there. For me, I'm perfectly happy with Rapid being Carbide's representation on this list, so I don't think there's a big omission. But I think the Behemoth one would have been nice, probably in the 80s or 90s as a shout. By far, the biggest request on the list, and this is where we're going to give Nick some time. The biggest request, hands down, from everybody, was the omission of TR2 v Carbide. And I'm just going to hand straight to Nick. Let's go, Nick.
Okay, so people listening, passionate Ultimate Countdown fans, I may have disappointed you once with this fight not appearing full stop. I'm gonna disappoint you even more by saying that it was there and I cut it at the last minute as well to add insult to injury.
And who'd you cut it for, Nick?
It was Exterminator Killer Carrot 2 that came in.
Great suggestion from Toast.
Yeah, and you know what? That's only going to make your anti-Series 7 fan base even angrier now.
Oh, bloody hell. But to make you guys maybe even more angry, I'm going to stick by what I did and not have it on the list at all. Now, we know that me and Toast have kind of made the flaws of this fight a little bit evident lately, because we mentioned how TR2 gets wrecked and then Carbide stops working, but it obviously gets compared to Apollo Carbide, the title fight, which did make the list in the 40s, 47 or something, I don't know. And the obvious argument is, well, these are two similar fights then, so they should both be on or both not be. I still disagree. Difference being, Apollo completely takes Carbide on at the start, completely holds its own, flips Carbide really high, gets some good early flips in while Carbide is working to its best. Whereas TR2, as I've just said, gets completely mullered until Carbide's weapon just stops working. And guess what? We also see the limitations of TR2 past the point. It could make this fight entertaining still, and it did in the moment. But ultimately, you compare TR2 and Carbide, TR2 and Apollo as machines, and one is much more explosive and entertaining than the other. You want an example from this fight? The remaining 2 minutes of both of them, where Apollo still gets a lot of big flips in. And you even see the difference in the two machines when they face each other, where Apollo completely dominates and TR2 gets in like one rolled flip. So basically, TR2 can't fill up the dead air in this fight, which is essentially Carbide's weapon breaking, whereas Apollo can. Apollo even clamps down and guides it into the house spots. All TR2 does is slightly topple it over into the arena wall a bit and nearly gets baited into the pit. Unfortunately, that's about it.
Yeah, well, not nearly. Carbide doesn't fall for it at all. This is the beauty of us having video clips alongside what we're saying right now, because if you just think about it, then of course TR2 versus Carbide sounds like it should be on the top 100, because when we all watched it in the grand final, we were in disbelief that TR2 would ever beat Carbide. I mean, I predicted it going into the episode, but then I probably withdrew that claim as the episode went on.
Yeah, well, I'll just make another quick point here while I remember it. Obviously, people can easily point out as well that this was number 1 in my Series 8 fights list. And that's obviously going to be pointed out as a bit of a hole in my explanation of the two fights. What will I give as an explanation? Simply put, I made this video the day after the grand final. I hadn't rewatched the fights. I wanted to get it out as soon as possible to get the video as many views as possible, which it has with over 2.5 million now. And yeah, so I was living in the moment while editing the video, and this fight is the biggest one that falls foul of the no rewatch value, unfortunately. You go from thinking TR2's getting the better of this massive spinner to, oh, there's 2 minutes of nothing here.
Yeah, it's trying to go for an Uta and it can't.
It can't because it's like the weakest flipper in the reboot.
So basically, if I were to describe it in one sentence, a miraculous result in the moment, but one of the most utterly not rewatchable fights in all of Robot Wars. It loses every bit of appeal on a rewatch, as I'm sure you've just noticed while watching along with this video. Which means we can move on to Series 9 to talk about a more powerful flipper briefly in its melee. This is, of course, Eruption, in a great little back and forth with Behemoth, Cobra, and Hobgoblin, nominated by Alex the Hunted. And it's one of 3 Eruption Behemoth fights in history. One got on the list, which is the Series 10 one. It was arguably too high.
Which is the 3rd best of the 3, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't honestly know which I prefer out of the Series 10 head-to-head and this melee, but absolutely I maintain that the Series 9 fight, which ends with an Uta, should have been on the list where the real Eruption Behemoth entry is, because it's a better fight. But it's too late for that now. We've already talked about it before. Is there anything in particular we want to say about the melee that Alex the Hunter?
I'd probably put the melee in place of both fights, because the melee it's great to see Eruption and Behemoth both hurling Cobra around. The only thing you can take away from this fight is that Hobgoblin craps the bed so early on.
Yeah,
so
it's a really good fight. It was initially in my draft, and I enjoy it a lot. But I think what you just said there kind of hinders it. It is a Eruption and Behemoth attacking a machine. It's basically a tag team 2-on-1. They barely go.
It's 2-on-2 where Hobgoblin's defeated early on. Yeah, that's what it is.
Eruption and Behemoth barely go for each other and the longer you watch the fight when you rewatch it, the more that Cobra just feels like it's not ever going to get a chance to breathe. So yeah, if all the machines had their exchanges of flips and rams and everything, and it was more balanced, I think it would definitely be there. But it feels so inevitable that Cobra is going to be the one that loses in the judge's decision that it just about falls off.
There was no suspense as to the winner.
Unfortunately.
It was really always going to be Eruption and Behemoth, but it should definitely get credit for Cobra going the distance, because, I mean, who else in Series 9 Round 1 went the distance? I don't think anybody did.
No.
Literally
Nobody else did, so full credit. Quick shout to Supernova and Frostbite, which is a great moment fight, but that's literally all. Frostbite was
basically
never going to win.
all I would say about that one is that if I could sub in one more destructive spinner fight, maybe Carbide versus Behemoth as my first pick. The second one would be likely to be Hypnodisc Atomic, but certainly on a personal grounds, I have a much bigger preference for Supernova Frostbite, having watched it in person and see Frostbite literally
Yeah, and I think there is definitely value for this fight to be on the list now, especially, because I think if I included this one, it would allow me to move the Hypnodisc Series 3 fights up as well.
Yes.
This would have been
100%.
like the perfect example of a powerful spinner just obliterating something that's completely rubbish. So it gives me the excuse to bump the other two up a solid amount. So yeah, I think that would work better then.
You underrated this fight even in the top 15 Series 9 battles. You didn't even put it in the... you put it 14th, I think, or 15th.
Well, it's not a good
to start
fight,
off
so
with.
let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Like, there's no fight. It's just Supernova disintegrates Frostbite on, like, the second hit, so...
Well, why don't you tell us about a good fight from Series 9?
I'd
then?
love to, but we're an hour and 42 minutes, and you took up all my time when we gave me a blow-by-blow of Mad Dog versus ICUV Chopper. So what I'll do is I'll request that Nick play Heavy Metal versus Mr. Speed Squared over the closing discussion so that everybody can watch it and enjoy it.
Sure.
So the only thing I'll say about this fight, I was campaigning for it from day one. Nick put it in the April Fool's Day video just to fool me, and it still didn't tip me off that it was an April Fool's Day video. I had already written out my comments saying, I'm really glad you did it, but now I think you might have overrated it, before I realised it was a joke. So it's an incredible fight, and I think I need to mention that Nick gave Terahertz and Rapid credit for a robot using the whole arena. Watch this fight again. Heavy Metal uses every arena hazard, the flipper, the flames, the spikes, the house robots, and the only pitting in Series 9. And the reason this fight is terrific is we saw Mr. Speed Squared cripple Heavy Metal in the first round. So the stakes were really high. Of course, in hindsight, everyone knows Mr. Speed Squared shits the bed in round 2 100% of the time, so the tension's not there. So it loses some rewatch value, but it's a great fight, and I really encourage everybody to watch it.
I literally watched it in person from within the audience, and I didn't even care that much.
Yeah, well, that's fine. Last fight, we're going to give one really quick shout out to Eruption, Aftershock, Crackers and Smash. I don't like this fight, but I think Nick said that it probably would be on the list in a redraft.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of my really big boo-boos. I think it's a fantastic fight with controversy. That might take away from it. That was what stopped me putting it on there, because I did feel it was kind of tainted when it was in recent memory. But now it's a little bit in the past. I just think, well, look, we just got a vertical flywheel basically ootering itself by landing on top of the arena wall after a massive flip. And then Eruption gets 2 more ooters. So,
granted, those are on Crackers and Smash.
yeah,
so
absolutely. But one of them does hit the
Yeah.
the arena door. So, no.
Yeah, it's the triple and they're the big flips. Of course, when I saw this just in person, without getting to hear the Roboteers, there was no controversy affecting my viewing of the fight whatsoever. And as a result, I saw Carbide versus Gabriel like an hour later, and I preferred this fight. I just absolutely adored Eruption's triple
Yeah.
Uta. Phenomenal. I would have put it in the top
Oh,
100
absolutely.
myself, but I understand why it missed out because it had that kind of
I
timing.
would have put it in the 50 to 40 section. It's that big
Oh,
of a
that's
blow
too
for
high.
me.
Go on then.
I really think it's a fantastic melee, but we could be here all day trying to justify a fight this tainted. So
And we're coming up to an hour and 46, so I'm afraid we're not going to get to talk about Nuts 2 versus Androne. So sorry about that, guys. Bring it to the comment section. What we're going to do now is close up shop with a quick discussion. Toast, favourite fight left off the list.
Well, we'll swap the word favourite probably
Okay,
for which one would I sub in. I would say one that we breezed past altogether. Razor O's nomination of DTK's featherweight.
oh
melee.
yeah, we forgot that one. Look, we want to just give it
a brilliant
quick,
fight all the way through.
terrific. Should have been on the list. I was gobsmacked when we were watching it before this video recording, and I forgot why I was watching it because I just assumed it was on the list. So that's full praise for that shout out there. So favourite fight, mine. I think the biggest omission from the list was Dominator 2 101. That's my personal. Objectively, I think it's Big Cheese Chaos 2. Toast, what's yours?
I mean, the featherweight melee was a bit of a blend of two, where I think it could objectively be on there, and it's one that personally benefits me as well. I guess if we exclude the obvious Mad Dog, then I'll go with Mute versus Judge Shred 3 as my personal pick.
And then let's just have a quick discussion. What do you think the next 10 fights, 110 to 101, were on the list? And I'll give you some, and you tell me whether you've got it or not. Razor v Bearmoth from Extreme.
Yeah.
Nick?
I haven't done the next 10. I have had.
Okay, fine.
I have had.
Just give us a
Neither
general
have I.
nod or not.
I was
Okay,
gonna-
so these are the 10 that I've written down. Hypnodisc versus Atomic.
Okay, good one.
Yep. Storm 2, Firestorm 5. Yes or no?
Possibly.
Possibly.
Maybe at
Probably
like the bottom
not.
of it.
Bigger Brother versus Tornado.
Probably not.
Yep.
Firestorm 3 versus Wild Thing.
Probably not.
I guess if it's 10, maybe.
Yep. Big Cheese
Not
Chaos 2.
definitive.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Eruption Crackers and Smash Aftershock.
Absolutely.
Yep.
I put TR2 Carbide. Should I have not put that?
Yeah, just delete that one,
Don't.
please.
I put this down before we started talking. And then I rounded out with two personal ones of mine, which are Gravity and Lightning.
Good shout. Yep, you've
Fair enough.
basically convinced me over in that past episode, so
Thank
Okay.
you.
very much.
And then I put the Toughest Nails Third World Championship Melee.
Fantastic.
So that basically means to me that, yeah, the Firestorm Wild Thing and the other one, that's turned into a no for me because we absolutely need both of 259's Series 6
Oh, yeah,
battles
no, you're right there.
from its
Yep.
heat.
And I think Razor Milliamp Bug would probably be there. If I wrote this list after we did this podcast, I'd probably put Razor Milliamp Bug on this.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, guys, tell us what your 101 to 110 are in the comments section. We'd love to read them and give you guys shouts out for good shouts in future podcasts. But other than that, I think we're finally closing up shop. Any final shouts? Hope you guys have enjoyed the ride.
Well, shout outs to Nick for his ultimate countdown, which has given us hours and hours of entertainment.
Yeah, well done, Nick.
Thank you.
Shame about Dominator 2 versus 101.
Yeah, you can't be perfect.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening to our three-parter. We'll see you next time for future content.
Thank you.